I cannot stay there. Not one more day. She was huddled against the cliff face where the landslide had caught her. Her massive frame folded awkwardly among the fallen rocks, one shoulder clearly dislocated. Her breathing came in controlled pulls, each one managed with visible effort. The rain had found her hours ago and showed no signs of mercy. No shelter, no supplies, nothing but the storm and the ocean roaring below. Her cloak was soaked through her boots, torn from days of rough terrain, and still she sat upright like she was refusing to let the elements claim her. Garrett had come to check his nets before the storm worsened. He found her instead. She was tall, even sitting down, broad-shouldered, gray-green skinned, with the kind of face that usually made fisher folk cross themselves and hurry past. He was not a brave man by any measure, but she was shaking from cold that had gotten into her bones, and he could see the wrongness of her shoulder even from 10 feet away. He set his lantern on a stable rock without a word and approached carefully, offering the only things he had help and the decency to give it quietly. What he didn't see, half concealed in the wet tangle of her dark hair, was the thin silver chain woven with small blue stones, a mark of the Wave Chief's bloodline, something anyone from the coastal clans would recognize immediately. She pulled her hood lower and said nothing more. The village of Crestfall sat on the cliffs like something the sea had grudgingly allowed to remain. 23 houses, a fish market that operated when the weather permitted, and a shore temple where people went not to pray, but to leave offerings and hope the ocean noticed. The waves came hard here and left harder, and in between they did whatever they wanted. Garrett Moss had lived at the southern edge of Crestfall for 5 years, which meant he'd lived at the southern edge of everything for 5 years. His stone cottage sat a quarter-mile from the nearest neighbor, separated by a rocky path that turned treacherous when wet. The roof was slate that he replaced each spring. The chimney drew well on calm days and smoked on rough ones. The pantry in late autumn held enough for one man who asked little of life. He was 32. He had the hands of someone who'd worked rope and clay for years, and the eyes of a person who'd learned to expect very little and was therefore rarely disappointed. He wasn't unhappy exactly. Unhappy suggested active struggle against something. Garrett had stopped struggling a long time ago. He simply existed quietly and carefully, the way a man exists when he's decided the world contains a finite amount of warmth, and he'd already used most of his share. He made pottery for Crestfall's market. He fished when the weather allowed. He kept a small herb garden that produced more than he needed in summer, which meant he left bundles on old Mira's doorstep without explanation. He'd had a cat once, an orange Tom named Copper, who died 2 winters back. The empty spot by the fire remained unfilled. That evening, he'd been heading down to the cove later than he should have. The storm had moved faster than the sky had promised. He'd felt it in the way the wind changed that salt-thick quality that meant the ocean was serious about what came next. He'd secured what he could, checked his nets one final time, and started back up the cliff path with his lantern, his mind on small things. Whether the chimney would smoke tonight, whether he had enough lamp oil, the thoughts of a man whose world was deliberately small. Then he'd heard it, a sound that wasn't wind or waves. He found her 40 feet off the main path where the cliff face created a shallow overhang that must have seemed like shelter. She'd made it that far and no further. The landslide had caught her, or perhaps she'd already been injured when it hit. Either way, she was down, and she'd been down for a while. Even injured and half frozen, she was extraordinary. She stood nearly a head taller than any man in Crestfall, built along different lines, entirely broad through the shoulders, powerfully muscled in a way that spoke of genetics rather than training. Her skin was deep gray-green, like storm-tossed kelp, and her hair black as deep water hung heavy with rain. She had tusks, short-curved, the lower pair prominent, and eyes the color of sea glass that watched him with an intensity that made his breath catch even as he knelt to help her. Her clothing was wrong for the situation. Not inadequate, it had been quality enough to offer protection, but wrong in the way fine things look wrong in desperate circumstances. The cloak was seawool, the kind that cost more than Garrett made in 3 months. The boots, though torn, had been made by someone who understood their craft. Even the belt half hidden under her soaked coat had silver work too intricate for a common traveler. She told him to leave. She said it with an authority that expected obedience. He pressed his scarf against the gash on her arm and told her in quiet, steady terms that he'd go once he'd stabilized her shoulder and gotten her somewhere dry. She stared at him as though he'd spoken a foreign language. Perhaps he had. He got her to his cottage through a combination of sheer stubbornness and her grudging, furious cooperation. She didn't thank him. She gripped his shoulder with her good arm and said nothing at all, which he found easier to work with than alternatives. At the cottage by the struggling fire, he examined her shoulder. She watched him with those sea-glass eyes, tracking every movement, assessing something he couldn't name. He'd been assessed before by merchants and neighbors. He'd never been assessed quite like this. He worked without much conversation. Set the shoulder, she made one sharp sound and immediately controlled it. Cleaned the gash on her arm, deep but clean, which was better than it could have been. Wrapped it with clean linen. When he offered her the bowl of fish stew he had been planning for his own dinner, she looked at it for a long moment as though uncertain of the correct response. Then she took it with both hands and ate slowly, carefully, like someone raised to be observed even in moments of vulnerability. She'd hidden her left hand beneath her leg before he could see what she wore. He'd caught only a glimpse of silver, nothing more. He gave her his bed. She looked at it, a narrow thing barely adequate for him, clearly inadequate for her frame, and he could see her calculating pride versus exhaustion. Exhaustion won. She lowered herself onto it with careful movements of someone managing significant pain and closed her eyes. She didn't sleep immediately. He could tell by her breathing, but she let him think she did, which he understood to be its own form of trust. He settled into the chair by the fire, pulled a blanket over himself, and listened to the storm make its argument against the walls. Like most people living in remote places far from cities, he'd heard stories about orcs his whole life and believed most to be exaggerated. He was revising that assessment now, though not in the direction most people would expect. She wasn't what the stories described. The stories described something to fear. What he'd brought in from the storm was something to wonder at. He wondered at her until he fell asleep. Garrett Moss had been born in a fishing town called Harmouth, 3 days' ride south, which no longer existed because a series of harsh winters and failed catches had driven everyone away when he was 20. Not dramatically, no single catastrophe, but gradually the way communities die when hope runs out before people do. His mother had died when he was 16, a wasting sickness the local healer couldn't cure. His father had lasted until the final winter, working the boats until the day he didn't come home from the sea. The village had called it an accident. Garrett knew his father had simply chosen the ocean over another empty season. He'd stayed and worked the pottery kiln for 2 more years because leaving felt like a second abandonment. Then the last families left. Then a choice between following them to the southern cities or finding somewhere quieter. He'd chosen quieter. He drifted north, worked where work existed. A tannery in one place, a merchant's warehouse in another. He'd been competent at most things and exceptional at none, which was the honest truth. He had a steadiness that employers valued and a quietness that people eventually stopped trying to fill. He'd come to Crestfall because they needed a potter and didn't ask unnecessary questions. He'd been capable with clay. He liked the solitude. He stayed because staying was easier than leaving and because the cliffs reminded him of nothing, which meant they couldn't hurt him with memories. He'd loved once briefly a woman named Sarah, who had quick hands and a laugh he could still recall with painful clarity. She'd married a merchant's son from the eastern ports because that was the practical choice and he didn't blame her for it. He'd never been practical from a survival standpoint. He had, however, always been decent. That was the thing he held on to when everything else slipped through his fingers. He helped people because not helping felt worse than helping. Because there had been a day in Harmouth when his father had needed someone to notice he was struggling, and Garrett had been at the kiln, and by the time he'd noticed something was wrong, it was already too late to matter. He'd been noticing ever since. What Garrett didn't know as he slept in his chair with the storm battering the walls was that the woman in his bed was Thera Stormcrown, first daughter of the Wave Chief. She was 28 years old. She'd held the title of first daughter for 7 years since her older brother had died in a territorial dispute with the mountain clans. She'd inherited responsibility and grief simultaneously, which was a combination poets never mentioned when they wrote about power. The coastal clans were prosperous, strategically positioned between 3 human trade routes and 2 rival orc territories. Her position required constant negotiation, constant vigilance, constant performance. Every morning she became Thera who leads, and every night she set that person down carefully and wondered how much longer the woman beneath could sustain the weight. 5 weeks ago, she'd left the clan hold in secret. Not entirely her chief advisor, An ancient orc named Volkara knew where she was going, and her captain of the guard, a scarred veteran named Kresh, had argued violently against the journey. But Thera had received a message she couldn't ignore. Her father, the Wave Chief, had arranged her marriage to the eldest son of the Tidecaller clan, a political alliance, a treaty signed in her name without her consent. She'd known it was coming, such arrangements were traditional, but she'd thought she had more time. The wedding was set for the next full moon, 3 weeks away. She'd gone to meet with an old friend, a neutral clan leader in the Northern Territories, hoping for advice, for options, for anything except the crushing inevitability of her future being decided by political necessity. The journey back had been interrupted by the storm and the landslide, and her own exhaustion finally catching up with choices made in desperation. She'd found the overhang. She'd told herself she'd rest briefly, then continue. Her body had made a different decision. She had never in her entire life been rescued. Not like this. Not by a cold-handed stranger in worn clothes who asked nothing, expected nothing, and simply pressed cloth against her wound with the matter-of-fact gentleness of someone who'd tended injuries before and saw no reason to make it complicated. She didn't know what to do with that. Her whole life people had helped her because she was the first daughter, or because they feared her position, or because they wanted something from her authority. This man didn't know what her position was. He'd helped her because she was bleeding in the rain. She lay in his narrow bed, listened to him breathe in sleep, and held the silver chain with its blue stones against her palm. She thought about what that meant and couldn't find a precedent for it anywhere in her experience. She had nightmares about her brother's death. She always did in unfamiliar places. She kept them quiet mostly. That night, one broke through. She heard him stir but didn't acknowledge it. She heard him get up, add wood to the fire, just the blanket she'd kicked off. He didn't ask questions. He just made sure she was warmer. She couldn't remember the last time someone had done something for her without calculating what they'd receive in return. The storm held for 5 days. The first day was tense. She slept in fragments and ate what he offered with careful reserve. He moved around her with the practiced quietness of someone accustomed to sharing small spaces with large silences. He didn't pepper her with questions. He didn't stare openly. He checked her shoulder and arm morning and evening, explained what he was doing before he did it, and otherwise gave her space to be uncomfortable in her own way. She told him her name was Thera. Not false, it was what her mother had called her before titles changed everything. He told her his name was Garrett. They both accepted the exchange without ceremony. She watched him constantly. She couldn't help it. He was interesting in a way she hadn't anticipated. His hands moved with unconscious competence of someone who'd shaped clay and mended things for years. He repaired a cracked shutter with the storm still raging, using what he had on hand and a technique that struck her as elegantly improvised. He cooked what he had with the attention of someone who'd learned that seasoning mattered when ingredients were limited. On the second day, when the wind finally dropped enough for conversation to feel natural, he asked where she'd been headed. She gave him honest geography and nothing else. South toward the coastal roads. She'd been delayed. He nodded as though being delayed on a cliff path in a landslide with an apparent shoulder injury was perfectly reasonable, and he had no follow-up questions. She tested him. She said directly that she was capable of leaving as soon as the storm passed, and he shouldn't feel obligated to continue hosting her. He said the storm wasn't finished, and her shoulder needed more time to heal, and the paths would be dangerous for days after this much rain anyway. Then he went back to working clay at his wheel in the corner. She stared at his back for a longer moment. Orc culture ran to directness and transactional clarity. If someone helped you, you knew what they expected in return, and you negotiated it openly. Everyone understood where they stood. This man seemed to operate on an entirely different system, one where helping was simply something you did, and expecting repayment wasn't built into the equation. She found it deeply suspicious, and underneath the suspicion, strangely moving. On the third evening, she asked him why he lived alone. He was quiet for a while. Then he told her about Harmouth. Not all of it, the shape of it. The failed catches the slow exodus, the drift north. She listened the way she'd been trained fully without composing her response while he was still speaking. She told him when he finished that she understood what it meant to carry something that didn't get lighter no matter how long you held it. He looked at her, then direct eye contact for the first time more than a glance, and she saw him recalibrate something. He wasn't simple, she realized. He was honest. Those weren't the same thing. She taught him the Orcish word for thalcarao endurance, more precisely translated as the strength to continue when the reason for continuing has been forgotten. He repeated it badly 3 times and correctly on the fourth. The expression on her face when he got it right surprised them both because it was unmistakably warmth. He taught her the local word for haven friend, the specific relationship of someone who'd shared your shelter without obligation. She repeated it slowly. She said she'd never had one of those. He said he hadn't either. Not really. They sat with that for a moment. On the fourth day, the storm broke. Her shoulder was better not healed. She'd need another week before she could travel safely but functional. She could have left. She stood at his door in the early morning, looking at the mud-slicked cliff path, and knew she could manage the journey if she was careful. She went back in mind and sat down by the fire and told him with the bluntness that was simply her nature that she'd stay 3 more days and help where she was able as payment for his hospitality. He said she didn't owe him anything. She said she was aware of that, and she was doing it anyway, and he should stop arguing because she'd already decided. He blinked. Then he laughed a short, surprised sound, and she found unexpectedly that she liked making him do that. She helped him gather clay from the cove the next morning, carrying loads that would have taken him 3 trips in one. He watched her technique, then after a moment showed her a better way to test the clay's consistency for throwing. She considered being insulted. She decided to be impressed instead. She incorporated the adjustment without comment and pretended she'd always done it that way. They worked together in the pottery shed that afternoon. She had no experience with clay, and she admitted as much. He explained the wheel, the centering, the slow building of walls. She watched with the careful attention of someone who took craft seriously and said it was more complicated than she'd expected, and that she meant it as a compliment. He said he understood and that he'd deliberately made it look easy so anything she produced would seem like an achievement. She stared at him. Then she laughed, a real one, low and sudden and unguarded. He looked startled, then pleased, then quickly looked back at the clay as though he hadn't noticed. That night she fell asleep against his shoulder on the bench by the fire somewhere in the middle of a conversation about whether the southern trade ships would return before winter set in properly. She woke at some point and found he hadn't moved. She should have shifted away immediately. She waited another few minutes before she did. She was Thera who leads. She had clans to return to and a marriage to face and a political structure that required her constant attention. She had no business developing an attachment to a potter in a drafty cottage at the edge of nowhere. She was developing one anyway, and she knew it, and she sat with that knowledge in the pre-dawn darkness and made peace with the impossibility of it, the way you make peace with things you cannot change. On the 8th day, they found her. Not Garrett, someone else. A young orc scout, barely 23, appeared on the cliff path at dawn. Professional, controlled, but relief was visible on his face when he saw her. He'd been searching the coastal routes for 6 days. He hadn't expected to find what he found when Thera stepped onto Garrett's threshold. The relief on the scout's face was followed immediately by confusion, then by the kind of formal, rigid correctness that orc warriors deployed when deeply unsure of protocol. He spoke to her in the clan tongue, rapid, urgent. She answered in the same calm and quiet. Her entire posture shifted into something Garrett had never seen her wear. He stood in his doorway and watched a woman he didn't quite recognize speak to a soldier who was visibly anxious about her, and he understood in a slow, specific way that he had misjudged the situation considerably. She dismissed the scout to wait at the cliff edge. Then she turned to look at Garrett. He asked quietly who she was. She told him everything. Thera Stormcrown, first daughter of the Wave Chief, the arranged marriage, the desperate journey north, the reasons for secrecy. She held nothing back, though it took her a moment to begin, and her eyes were watchful in a way that told him she was afraid not of him, but of what his face would do when she finished. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said she'd been sleeping in his bed for 8 days and eating his fish stew and laughing at his jokes, and she was first daughter of the coastal clans. She said yes. He said the offer to help with the clay suddenly made more sense. She looked at him and couldn't read his expression. That it was unusual. She'd always been able to read people. He turned and went back inside. She followed because she owed him that, and because she was afraid of the silence between them. He sat down at the table. She sat across from him. The fire worked its slow business. He said he wasn't angry she hadn't told him. He understood she hadn't known him. What he was trying to work out, he said, was what to do with the fact that he'd been treating her as an equal all week, and she clearly wasn't. Not in any way the world measured. She said she hadn't felt unequal once in his cottage. She said she'd found that harder to handle than she'd expected. He looked at her. She said she wanted him to know that the person he'd helped on the cliff and talked to by the fire and argued with about clay consistency, that was her. Not a disguise, not a performance. She was that person all the time underneath the title. She just rarely had the opportunity. He said he believed her. He said he also needed a moment. She gave him the moment. What broke it wasn't a tender realization, but the scout returning at a run, shouting clan tongue warnings that even Garrett could read by their urgency. Two riders coming fast, tide caller scouts. The scout managed in rough common tongue. Both Garrett and Thera moved at the same time in the same direction without needing to discuss it. What followed wasn't graceful. Garrett knew the cliff terrain the way you know a place you've walked daily for 5 years. He used it directing Thera through the cove path behind his cottage, drawing one scout off with noise and a thrown rock that suggested a fleeing target. Thera, for her part, handled the other scout with speed and efficiency that was both terrifying and precise. Her shoulder was still healing, but her training went deeper than injury. She had a knife that had been hidden in her boot for 8 days. She used it decisively and non-lethally, which spoke to discipline that went far beyond simple survival. The Wave Chief Scout accounted for the second rider. In the aftermath, in the rocks behind his cottage, Garrett sat with his back against stone, hands shaking. Thera crouched in front of him, her sea-glass eyes level with his, checking him for injuries he hadn't noticed taking. He'd caught a blow to the shoulder from a horse's panic. She pressed her hand against it with firmness that somehow conveyed both assessment and something not purely medical. He said a little breathlessly that she was remarkable. She said he had better survival instincts than most warriors she'd served beside. He said that was either a compliment or a very low bar. She said it was both and held his gaze and said his name, Garrett, for the first time in a way that meant she was choosing to use it, not just producing it. They looked at each other in the rocks behind his cottage while the ocean wind rebuilt itself overhead, and both of them knew. The knowing was inconvenient and enormous, and neither of them said anything about it directly because the moment was too real for words that would diminish it. Her people arrived on the 10th day. 18 riders, her guard Captain Kresh at the front, a tall, scarred orc, whose expression when she saw Thera alive moved through relief and fury and professional control so fast it was almost a single emotion. With them came horses' supplies, a change of clothes for the first daughter, and the very clear implication that Thera Stormcrown was needed back at the clan hold immediately. Thera had them set up at the cliff edge. She asked for an hour. She got Garrett alone in the cottage. She stood in the center of the room, fully herself now, the bearing she'd been concealing since that first night, fully present. The traveling clothes replaced with proper Wave Chief leathers, her posture carrying the weight of what she was. She was remarkable. She'd always been remarkable. He simply understood the full scope of it now. She said she wasn't good at this kind of conversation. She said orc courtship customs were more direct than human ones, and she intended to use her own customs because she didn't know his, and she'd rather be honest than fumble through traditions she'd probably misunderstand. He said he appreciated that. She told him he'd saved her life. She said she knew he hadn't done it for what came after, and she wasn't offering what came after as payment. She was clear on that distinction, and she needed him to be clear too. She said she was offering what came after because she wanted to. She told him he could come to the clan hold, not as a dependent, not as charity, as someone under her protection with standing in the community, with work that suited him if he wanted it, with a role she would build for him if he was willing to help her build it. She said she had advisors who told her what she wanted to hear, and guards who protected her body, and not one single person who talked to her the way he did. She said she needed that more than she needed most things she had. She said, I am asking you to come with me. I am not asking you to be something you're not. I am asking you to be exactly what you are in a different place with me. She didn't say the word love. That wasn't how her culture moved. But she said, I want you there. And in her voice, it carried the same weight. He stood in the center of his drafty cottage and looked at the woman who'd arrived in his life 10 days ago as a bleeding stranger in the storm, and he felt the familiar pull of smallness. The voice that said he was a man from a dead town with worn tools and no particular claim to anything, and the world she was describing wasn't for people like him. He let that voice speak. Then he let it finish. Then he thought about Copper's empty spot by the fire, about the pantry with enough for one, about 5 years of being at the edge of everything and deciding it was acceptable. He said, "I'm afraid I'll disappoint you." She said she was afraid of many things too, and she'd found that doing them anyway was the only approach that worked. He said, "I want to come, not because of what you're offering, because of who you are when no one's watching." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said that was the most orc thing a human had ever said to her, and she meant it as the highest possible compliment. He laughed. She smiled, that unguarded one, the one he'd earned the first time at the pottery wheel. He said yes, not to a position, to her. The clan didn't take it well. Thera had known this and prepared for it as much as preparation was possible. Garrett had understood it intellectually without quite bracing his heart for the reality. Kresh was first. The guard captain made her position clear within hours of their arrival at the clan hold. She wasn't opposed to the first daughter making personal choices, but she was opposed to a choice that would be used by political opponents as evidence of weakness or poor judgment. She said it with honesty and without cruelty, which Garrett found he respected, even while it landed squarely in the tender part of his chest. The clan elders were more pointed. 6 of them formally requested a meeting in the first week after Thera's return and used that meeting to outline the various ways in which the presence of a human, a potter, a nobody from a dead fishing town in the first daughter's household would complicate the negotiations with the Tidecaller clan. Then there was Malthor. He was 34, built like a siege engine, second son of the Tidecaller chief, and had been quietly understood by most of the Wave Chiefs Council to be Thera's intended match, the political alliance her father had arranged. He challenged Garrett formally not to combat. Even Malthor knew that would be absurd and possibly illegal under clan law. He challenged in the traditional form, available to rival suitors, a test of worth before the council, where Garrett would be asked to demonstrate what he offered. Garrett stood before 16 orc elders and one deeply skeptical guard captain in a hall that made his entire cottage look like a storage box, and he said the following in measured terms. He was not a warrior. He was not wealthy. He could not offer political alliance or bloodline or military strength. He could offer craft knowledge that might be useful in improving the clan's ceramic production, which he'd noticed from his brief tour was currently using inefficient kiln designs that wasted fuel and produced inconsistent results. He laid out the argument specifically with technical details he'd observed. The elders were quiet for a long time. Volkera, the ancient advisor, said the human had either done serious observation or was making remarkably specific guesses. Garrett said he'd done the observation. That's what potters do. Volkara said that was at minimum worth considering. It didn't resolve everything. It didn't come close. But Malthor withdrew his formal challenge. Not gracefully, he would nurse resentment for months, but he withdrew it. And 4 of the 16 elders indicated with carefully neutral expressions that they were willing to observe further. From Crestfall, there was less ceremony and more ugliness. Word traveled, as it always did. The fish merchant refused to buy pottery from someone who'd been harboring an orc in his home. 3 families he'd traded with for years crossed to the other side of the road when they saw him collecting his belongings. Old Mira, who was 76 and had no patience for other people's politics, gripped his hand firmly and said anyone who'd spent 5 years making beautiful things alone on a cliff deserved whatever happiness he could find, and that she hoped the orc first daughter had better judgment in men than Mira had at 30. Garrett took that with him. He left the cottage with what he could carry, locked the door, and told himself what he was walking toward was worth what he was leaving. He'd mostly convinced himself by the time the clan hold's gates came into view. 9 months in the Wave Chief clan hold felt less foreign. Not familiar, that would take years, but less like a place he was enduring and more like a place he was learning. He had a role that Vakara had helped define with pragmatic old advisor precision, craft advisor for ceramic production. He spent significant time working with the clan's potters, sharing techniques, redesigning kilns, improving efficiency. He was surprisingly good at it. He'd been quietly perfecting his craft his whole working life without ever having the resources or audience to share what he'd learned. He still made pottery. He worked in the clan's workshop when he had evenings that belonged to no one else, And Thera would sit on a stool that had been made slightly too small for her and watch him throw clay with the expression she'd first worn when he fixed the shutter, that quiet attention, that recalibration. She had become in these months slightly less armored, not weaker, precisely the opposite. She was more firmly herself than he'd ever seen her because she had somewhere private to set down Thera who leads. She did this with the careful joy of someone who discovered a room in a house they thought they knew completely. She taught him the honor greeting that distinguished allies from subordinates, the correct way to address a clan elder if you wanted them to take you seriously. The orc system of favor debt that was more nuanced than any human ledger system he'd encountered. He absorbed it with the patience he'd always had for learning things that mattered. He taught her was still teaching her that quietness wasn't weakness, that hesitation wasn't failure, that small things accumulated into meaning just as surely as grand gestures did. Kresh had come around. Not warmly, Kresh's professional skepticism was structural. It held the whole operation upright, but she'd been observed on 5 occasions speaking to Garrett in the way she spoke to people she considered worth her time. He considered that a significant victory and didn't mention it. There was an evening when the hard months of establishment were beginning to soften into something more like daily life. They sat together by the fire in Thera's private rooms. She had her head tipped back against the chair, eyes closed. The day finally released. He had his hands on a piece of clay he was working, finding the shape of it, without looking, muscle memory guiding his fingers. The room was quiet in the way quiet becomes when it's chosen rather than endured. He said, "Do you remember when you told me to leave you?" She said, "I remember thinking you were the most foolish person I'd ever encountered." He said, "I almost did leave." She said, "I know. I heard you hesitate." She didn't open her eyes. "I was afraid you would." He looked at her. "I'm glad I didn't." She said simply, "Yes." Outside, the clan hold went about its business. The clan that had watched their first daughter make an impossible choice was beginning slowly to see what she'd seen in him, not power, not prestige, but something harder to name and therefore easier to discount until it proved itself undeniable. It would take years to earn their full respect. He knew that. He wasn't in a hurry. He reached across and took her hand, the one with the silver chain properly repaired, and back around her wrist. She turned her hand and held his. 2 worlds, 1 fire, and the long, unhurried work of choosing each other every day, which was in the end the only kind of love that lasted. But the testing wasn't over. 4 months later, in the depth of winter, a crisis arrived that would either prove Garrett's worth to the skeptical elders or confirm their worst fears. A trading ship carrying critical supplies failed to arrive. This wasn't unusual. Winter storms often delayed shipments. But this ship carried medical supplies, including fever root, that the clan's healer needed to treat an outbreak spreading through the younger members. Without the fever root, children would die. Thera knew it. The council knew it. The entire hold held its collective breath. "We send boats," Malthor said in the emergency council session, "south through the coastal route. Find the ship, or what's left of it." "The coastal route is impassable in winter storms," Kresh said flatly. "We send boats, we're sending them to their deaths." "Then we send riders overland," another elder suggested. "That's a 4-day journey minimum in good weather. In this 6 days if we're lucky." Vokara shook her head. "The children don't have 6 days." Garrett had been sitting quietly in the corner, present because Thera had insisted but not speaking, because he understood the politics of when to offer input and when to observe. Now he spoke. "There's another option." Everyone turned to look at him. "The old Smuggler's Cove," Garrett continued, "south of here, sheltered from the worst of the winter storms. If the ship tried to wait out the weather, that's where they'd have gone. I know the route. I fished those waters for years before Harmouth collapsed." "You know it." Malthor's skepticism was audible. "The Smuggler's Cove in winter conditions. I navigated worse in Harmouth. The key is timing the tides correctly and knowing which channels stay navigable. If the ship's sheltered there, I can find them." Kresh leaned forward. "You'd go alone. I'd move faster alone. And I wouldn't risk anyone who doesn't know those waters." The council erupted in debate. Half argued it was foolish to trust a human with something this critical. The other half argued they had no better options. Thera let them argue for precisely 4 minutes. Then she stood and the room went silent. "Garrett goes," she said. "With my authority and my backing, Kresh give him the fastest boat we have and whatever supplies he needs. This council is dismissed." As the elders filed out, Malthor lingered. He looked at Garrett with something that might have been grudging respect. "Don't make the first daughter regret her faith in you, human." Garrett met his gaze steadily. "I don't intend to." When they were alone, Thera gripped his shoulders. "You don't have to do this." "Yes, I do. This is how I prove I belong here. Not with words, with action. If you don't come back, I'll come back." She pulled him into a fierce embrace. "You'd better." He left before dawn with a fast coastal skiff, a pack of supplies, and a map he'd drawn from memory of the southern channels. The wind was brutal, the waves savage, but he pushed forward. The ocean swallowed him like the mouth of some ancient creature. For 3 days, he navigated by memory and instinct, checking each sheltered cove methodically. The first 3 were empty. At the 4th, as he rounded the headland, where the cliffs created a natural breakwater, he saw it. The trading ship, anchored in the protected cove, crew huddled around fires on the beach. They'd been trapped for 8 days. They were running out of fuel, food, and hope. When Garrett sailed into the cove, the relief on their faces was palpable. "I'm here on behalf of the Wave Chief clan," he said. "We need to get you out of here and get those supplies to the hold." The ship's captain, a weathered human named Holt, stared at him. "The clan sent a human. The clan sent someone who knows these waters. Can your crew sail bomb? Most of us. 3 are injured from the storm. Then we move at first light. I'll guide you through the channels." That night, huddled around the fire with the crew, Garrett learned something unexpected. They weren't just carrying fever root. They were carrying a message. "We were supposed to deliver this to the first daughter herself," Holt said, producing a sealed letter. "From the Tidecaller Chief, formal proposal to renew marriage negotiations." Garrett took the letter carefully. Why now? Because words traveled, about the first daughter taking in a human, about changes in clan leadership. People are watching, wondering what it means. Holt studied him. "Are you the human?" "I am." He nodded slowly. "Then maybe you should know there was resistance to the shipment. Tidecaller factions that didn't want the Wave Chief getting this medicine. That's why we were forced into the storm route. Sabotage? Not proven, but the timing was convenient for some people." Garrett sat with that information as the fire burned low. Someone was actively working against the Alliance, against Thera, against peace. The conspiracy went deeper than anyone had realized. They left at dawn. The journey back was treacherous, narrow channels, shifting sandbars, injured crew who needed constant attention. But Garrett knew every current, every safe passage. 4 days later, they emerged from the southern channels to find Kresh and 20 warriors waiting with fresh supplies and medical teams. The relief on Kresh's face when she saw Garrett was quickly masked by professional composure. "The first daughter has been informed. You're to return immediately." The fever root reached the healer in time. The children recovered. The Tidecaller Chief's letter reached Thera, and the implications sent ripples through the entire political structure. But it was what happened in the Great Hall that mattered most. Thera called a full assembly, every elder, every clan leader, every household head. The hall was packed. Garrett stood beside her on the platform, acutely aware of hundreds of eyes on him. "We face a choice," Thera said, her voice carrying across the hall. "The Tidecaller Chief renews his proposal for alliance through marriage. Traditional partnership, political stability. This has merit." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. "But we also know there are forces, both orc and human, that will use any alliance as leverage. That will sabotage supplies meant for children to advance political goals. That will sacrifice lives for power." She turned to Garrett. "This man risked his life to save those children. He could have stayed safe within these walls. He chose to act. He chose us." She faced the assembly again. "I have chosen him as my consort, not because he is human, not despite being human, but because he embodies what we claim to value: courage, skill, and the wisdom to choose the hard right over the easy wrong." The hall was utterly silent. "Any who doubt his worth may challenge his standing. You may test his knowledge, his commitment, his value to this clan." Thera's voice was steel. "But know this, you will be testing my judgment as well, and I do not yield easily." For a long moment, no one moved. Then Volcara stood. The ancient advisor's voice creaked with age, but carried authority. "I have observed this human for 9 months. He has proven himself skilled in craft, brave in crisis, and humble in success. More importantly, he has made our first daughter content in ways I have not seen in the 7 years she has carried that burden. She looked directly at Garrett. I name him kin. It was a formal declaration, one that carried weight in clan law. One by one other elders stood, not all of them, but enough. Even Malthor stood slowly with visible reluctance. The human has earned his place. I do not have to celebrate it, but I acknowledge it. That night in their private rooms, Thera was quiet for a long time. You didn't have to risk yourself like that, she finally said. Yes, I did. They needed to see that I'm not just here because you chose me, that I choose you back, that I'll fight for this. She took his hand. The tide caller proposal will complicate everything. There will be more pressure, more danger. I know. And you still want this. He thought about Harmut swallowed by poverty, about 5 years in a cottage at the edge of everything, about spending most of his life on the margins watching from a distance. I spent 32 years being safe, he said, being small, being alone. I don't want safe anymore. I want this. I want you. I want to help build something that matters. She kissed him, then fierce and certain. Outside, the first winter snow began to fall. Inside, two people from different worlds sat by the fire and planned a future that shouldn't have been possible, but was. The formal bonding ceremony took place in early spring when the ice broke and the first ships returned to the harbors. It wasn't a traditional wave chief ceremony. Those involved elaborate 3-day rituals with witnesses from every allied clan. Thera had negotiated something simpler, something between both cultures, a recognition of what they were building rather than what tradition demanded. The ceremony was held in the clan hold's ocean courtyard, where the sound of waves provided constant backdrop. There were orc witnesses and a small number of humans, the ship Captain Holt, who'd carried their story south and decided it mattered. Old Mira, who'd made the journey from Crestfall, despite her age, because she'd decided some things were worth witnessing. From Crestfall, 5 people came, more than Garrett had expected. A few who'd traded with him, a young couple who'd always been kind, the priest from the shore temple, who said if the ocean allowed it, who was he to object? The ceremony was brief and honest. Garrett made his oath in his own language, and then with Thera's coaching in hers. She made hers in both with equal fluency because she'd been learning his tongue the same way she learned everything completely, with full attention. When he said the last words of his vow, his voice steady and quiet, and certain, she looked at him with the expression she almost never let anyone see, the one that was simply cleanly happy. They lived primarily at the clan hold, with the understanding that the hold now included, after 9 months of Garrett's careful work, dramatically improved kilns, a thriving ceramics workshop that was beginning to produce trade-quality goods, and a small but growing exchange with human craftspeople who were curious about orc techniques. He had become in the hold's working life something that had no formal precedent, the first daughter's consort, who was also the person you consulted when you wanted to improve a production process or solve a technical problem. He was not high-ranking, he was not a warrior, but he'd earned respect through competence, and in the meritocratic structure of the coastal clans, competence mattered more than bloodline. There were still people who wouldn't accept it. There would probably always be. The Tidecaller clan sent formal protests disguised as diplomatic correspondence. Certain voices in Crestfall would mutter for years. The world had opinions about people who crossed lines it had carefully drawn. But Thera had spent her whole life learning to carry difficult things, and she'd found to her ongoing surprise that difficult things were considerably lighter when you weren't carrying them alone. One morning, 8 months after the ceremony, Garrett woke before dawn and built up the fire in their shared quarters. Thera woke to the warmth of it, the smell of wood smoke and clay dust, and lay still for a while, listening to him move. The soft sounds of someone who knew where everything was, the tools, the kettle, the shelf where she kept her correspondence. He didn't know she was awake yet. He was doing the thing he always did in early mornings, simply existing quietly in his own company. She'd come to understand this was how he replenished himself, and she protected it without discussing it, the same way he'd learned which of her silences were thinking silence and which were tired ones and which were the kind that needed company. She said his name. Just his name. He turned. In the growing firelight, she could see his face, sleep-rumpled, unhurried, looking at her, with the look she'd thought about during those desperate weeks before she fled her father's hold, the look that saw her. She asked if he missed the cottage. He thought about it seriously the way he thought about everything. Then he said, "Sometimes, the quiet of it, the simplicity." She said she was sorry. He said he wasn't. She sat up and he brought her tea. He always made 2 cups, always had, since the first morning in his cottage, when she'd been a stranger at his fire. They sat together in the warming light, not talking much, not needing to. Outside, the hold was beginning to stir. She could hear the guard change. She could hear faintly the sound of the kitchen fires being stoked, the clan waking to the business of living. Their life was here now. It was complicated and public and full of politics and people who had opinions. Some days it was very hard, and some days it was very loud, and some days she looked at him standing in the middle of an orc clan hold with clay on his hands, talking seriously to a potter twice his size, and she felt the particular joy of finding something you didn't know you were looking for. He caught her looking across the courtyard on one of those days. He raised an eyebrow in the questioning way he had. "What is it?" She shook her head. "Nothing." He knew it wasn't nothing. He went back to his work. She went back to hers. But their peace was tested again 6 months later. The wave chief Thera's father fell ill. Not suddenly, but the kind of illness that crept up slowly, taking strength day by day, until what had seemed like temporary fatigue became something more serious. The healers were cautious in their prognosis. He would recover, they said, but it would take time, months, perhaps longer. He would need to delegate more responsibilities, which meant Thera would need to take on more of his duties, which meant Garrett would be more visible in clan leadership, which meant every skeptic who'd been quietly waiting for an opportunity would seize it. The challenge came from an unexpected direction, not from Malthor or the Tidecaller faction, from within the Wave Chief's own council. A senior elder named Gresh, who'd been silent during Garrett's initial acceptance, spoke up during a council meeting about trade negotiations. With all respect to the first daughter's choice, Gresh said, his tone suggesting respect was the last thing on his mind, "I question whether critical negotiations should be conducted with a human consort at the table. It sends a message of weakness to our allies." Thera's response was swift. "It sends a message that we value competence over tradition." Garrett's insights on coastal trade have proven more valuable than a dozen councils of people repeating what we've always done. "Insights on pottery techniques, perhaps," Gresh countered. "But diplomatic negotiations require understanding clan dynamics that no outsider can truly grasp." "Then it's fortunate," Garrett said quietly the first time he'd spoken in this kind of formal setting, "that I'm not trying to grasp clan dynamics from the outside. I'm asking questions from a different perspective. Sometimes the most valuable insight comes from someone who isn't invested in maintaining traditional hierarchies." And the room went very quiet. Gresh's expression darkened. "You presume much human." "I observe accurately. The coastal trade routes you're negotiating, they're failing because you're using the same approach that worked 30 years ago when the political landscape was entirely different. I'm suggesting adaptation, not tradition, is what's needed." Vokara, who'd been watching this exchange with interest, leaned forward. "Explain." Garrett pulled out a map he'd been working on: trade routes, political territories, resource flows. "The traditional approach treats each clan as an independent entity, but the reality is that coastal trade is now controlled by 3 major human merchant companies who don't care about clan politics. They care about efficiency and profit." He traced routes on the map. "If the coastal clans coordinated their negotiations, presented a unified front to these companies, you'd have significantly more leverage. But that requires thinking beyond individual clan interests to collective advantage." The council was silent for a long moment. Then Kresh surprisingly spoke up. "The human has a point. We've been negotiating in isolation while the merchant companies play us against each other." "This is precisely what I warned about," Gresh said. "Human thinking infiltrating our decision-making." "No," Thera said firmly. "This is strategic thinking, which is exactly what we need. The question isn't whether Garrett's perspective is human or orc. The question is whether it's effective." The debate raged for another hour, but when the vote came, Garrett's proposal passed by a narrow margin. Over the next several months, he worked with representatives from 3 coastal clans to coordinate their trade negotiations. It was delicate work requiring him to navigate not just human-orc tensions, but inter-clan rivalries that went back generations. He approached it the way he approached everything, with patience, careful observation, and a willingness to listen more than he spoke. The first coordinated negotiation with the merchant companies resulted in a 25% increase in trade prices for orc goods. The second negotiation, 3 months later, established exclusive partnerships that gave the clans guaranteed markets. Even Gresh had to acknowledge the results, though he did so with obvious reluctance. But success brought its own complications. As Garrett became more central to clan decision-making, the scrutiny intensified. Every choice was examined for evidence of bias toward human interest. Every proposal was questioned for hidden motives. There was a night about a year after the bonding ceremony when Garrett sat in their quarters feeling the full weight of it. The constant observation, the never-ending need to prove himself, the exhaustion of being simultaneously too visible and never quite seen for who he actually was. Thera found him staring into the fire, his usual calm replaced with something more frayed. She sat beside him without speaking, the way she'd learned to do. Just presence offered without demand. "I don't know if I can do this forever," he said quietly. "The proving, the testing, the constant awareness that half the council is waiting for me to fail." "You don't have to do it forever," Thera said. "What's today, and then tomorrow, and then the day after that? That's forever just broken into smaller pieces." "Yes, but it's also manageable. We carry impossible things by carrying them one day at a time." He looked at her. "Do you ever regret it? Choosing this path, you could have had a traditional alliance, simplified your political position." "I could have had security," Thera said. "I chose something else. I chose partnership. I chose someone who sees me. I chose you." Even with all the complications, especially with the complications, easy choices don't require courage. And I didn't fall in love with you because you made things simple. I fell in love with you because you made things honest. It was the first time either of them had used that word. Love. It hung in the air between them, significant and true. "I love you too," Garrett said. "I'm just tired." "Then rest. Stop trying to prove yourself tonight. Just be here with me." He leaned his head against her shoulder. She wrapped an arm around him, solid and certain. They sat like that until the fire burned low, two people holding each other through the hard parts, which was the real work of any partnership. The turning point came 2 years after the bonding ceremony. The wave chief had recovered enough to resume some duties, but he'd made it clear he was stepping back from daily governance. Thera was effectively leading the clan now, though the formal transfer of power wouldn't happen until the traditional ceremonies could be arranged. During this transition, a crisis emerged that would define how the coastal clans related to human territories for the next generation. A territorial dispute along the northern border threatened to escalate into violence. Human settlements were expanding into areas the clans considered traditional territory. The clans saw it as encroachment. The humans saw it as settling unclaimed land. Both sides were mobilizing forces. The clan council's immediate response was military. Send warriors to the disputed territory. Make it clear that expansion would be met with force. Thera called for a different approach. "We send negotiators first," she said. "We attempt diplomatic resolution before military action." "Diplomacy has failed for 20 years on this issue," Malthor argued. "The humans don't respect words. They respect strength." "Then we show strength through unity," Thera countered. "We coordinate with the other coastal clans. We present a unified position. We make it clear that further expansion means conflict with all of us, not just one clan." "And who leads these negotiations?" Gresh asked. The subtext was clear, surely not the human consort. "I do," Thera said, "with Garrett's assistance, because this requires understanding both how orcs think and how humans think. We need both perspectives." The council was divided, but Thera had the authority to proceed. What followed was 3 months of intense diplomacy. Garrett worked behind the scenes, helping Thera understand the political pressures driving human expansion, the economic factors that made the disputed territory attractive, the compromises that might satisfy both sides. But he also helped the human negotiators understand orc concepts of territory and tradition, the way land claims weren't just legal, but spiritual for the coastal clans. The final agreement wasn't perfect, it never was, but it established clear boundaries, created buffer zones, and most importantly, set up a permanent diplomatic council where disputes could be resolved without violence. The treaty was signed by representatives from 5 orc clans and 7 human territories. It was, by any measure, historic. At the signing ceremony, the human delegation leader, an older statesman named Corvus, who'd spent 40 years in territorial politics, pulled Garrett aside. "I've spent my career trying to prevent orc-human conflicts," Corvus said. "I've never seen anyone bridge that gap the way you have. You understand both sides without betraying either one." "I just listen," Garrett said. "No, you do more than that. You translate, not just words, perspectives. That's rare. That's valuable." Corvus paused. "There's talk in the human territories about what you've built here, about whether it's possible elsewhere. People are watching to see if we fail, watching to see if you succeed, because if you can make this work, maybe others can too." That night back at the hold, Thera found Garrett on the ocean wall looking out at the waves. "Corvus told me what he said to you," she said, joining him. "Does it worry you that we're being watched?" "No, it tells me we're doing something that matters. Things that don't matter don't attract attention." She took his hand. "My father wants to make the transition official. He's calling for the leadership ceremony in 3 months. You'll be wave chief. I'll be wave chief, and you'll be consort to the wave chief. The scrutiny will intensify. The challenges will multiply. Are you ready for that?" Garrett thought about the cottage on the cliffs, the quiet life he'd built, the safety of being unimportant. Then he thought about the treaty they'd just signed, the children saved by fever root, the coordinated trade that had strengthened 3 clans, the small daily work of building something that mattered. "I'm ready," he said, "not because I'm not afraid, but because I've learned that the things worth doing are usually the things that terrify you." Thera smiled. "When did you become wise?" "I'm not wise, I just pay attention." Same thing. The leadership ceremony 3 months later was attended by representatives from every coastal clan and numerous human territories. It was a statement both of Thera's authority and of the new reality of orc-human relations. When Thera took the Wave Chief's oath, Garrett stood beside her, not behind her, not subordinate, but beside her. Equal partner in building whatever came next. The years that followed were not easy. There were still resistors, still people who believed the old ways were better. There were still crises that tested their partnership and their resolve. There were still moments when Garrett wondered if he'd made the right choice, and moments when Thera questioned whether she'd asked too much. But there were also victories. A second treaty expanding the diplomatic councils to cover trade disputes. A cultural exchange program that sent orc artisans to human cities and human scholars to clan holds. The first mixed orc-human trading company, controversial, but profitable. And there were personal victories too. The day Garrett's pottery was featured in a clan ceremony as an example of how different traditions could create something new. The night Thera told him about her brother without crying for the first time in 7 years. The morning they woke up and realized they'd stopped counting days and started counting years. 5 years after Garrett had found Thera bleeding in the storm, they stood on the same cliff where they'd first met. "I was dying here," Thera said, looking at the rocks where she'd sheltered. "Not just physically. In every way that mattered. I'd given up." "I almost walked past," Garrett admitted. "I was so focused on getting home before the storm worsened. I almost didn't stop." "What made you stop?" "I don't know, instinct, luck. The feeling that if I didn't stop, I'd regret it for the rest of my life." She took his hand. "I'm glad you stopped." "Me too." They stood there as the sun set over the ocean, 2 people who'd chosen each other against every reasonable objection and built a life that neither could have imagined alone. It wasn't perfect, nothing ever was, but it was real and it was theirs and it was enough, more than enough. It was everything. 10 years after that first storm, Garrett stood in the great hall of the Wave Chief Hold, watching Thera address a joint council of orcs and humans about a proposed continent-wide trade agreement. She was magnificent, commanding, certain, everything a leader should be. But he knew the person underneath, the one who still woke from nightmares about her brother, who laughed like she'd forgotten she could, who sat with him in quiet mornings, and just existed without needing to be anything but herself. After the council session, she found him in the pottery workshop. He was throwing a large bowl, the kind he'd learned to make in those early months when he'd been trying to prove his worth through craft. She watched him work for a while the way she always had. That quiet attention that said, I see you. Remember when you told me you were afraid of disappointing me, she asked. Every day for the first 2 years. Are you still afraid? He considered the question seriously. Sometimes. But I've learned that fear of disappointing you means I care about your opinion. That's not a bad thing. You've never disappointed me. Not once, freak. I've made mistakes. Making mistakes isn't disappointing me. Giving up would be, and you've never done that. He finished centering the clay and looked at her. I couldn't give up. I love you too much. Still, always. She smiled, that unguarded one, the one he'd earned in a cottage during a storm and had been earning every day since. Good, she said, because I'm not done building this yet, and I need you here. I'm not going anywhere. Outside, the ocean continued its eternal conversation with the shore. Inside, two people who shouldn't have fit together but did continued building a future that proved impossible was just another word for not yet. They'd been told it couldn't work, that the differences were too great, that love across such divides was unrealistic, impractical, doomed to fail. They'd proven everyone wrong, not through grand gestures or dramatic victories, but through the quiet daily choice to see each other, to value each other, to build something together that was stronger than anything they could have built alone. That was the real story, not the political alliances or the trade agreements or the diplomatic victories, but two people choosing each other every single day, through storms and calm, through doubt and certainty, through fear and love. That was the foundation. Everything else was just details. 15 years after Garrett had found Thera in the storm, the Wave Chief hold had transformed into something neither of them had imagined when they'd first made their choice. The hold now housed a permanent diplomatic quarter where human and orc representatives lived and worked side by side. The pottery workshops had expanded into a thriving trade school where young orcs and humans learned crafts together. The Great Hall hosted monthly joint councils that had become so routine that people had stopped remarking on how extraordinary they were. But change at this scale created friction in ways that weren't always visible until they erupted. Garrett was 47 now, with gray threading through his hair and the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades navigating complex political waters. He stood in the workshop teaching a class of mixed students, 8 young people, 4 orc and 4 human, ranging in age from 16 to 23. They were working on advanced throwing techniques when the door burst open. A young orc woman named Kira stood in the doorway breathing hard, her expression somewhere between fury and desperation. She was one of his best students, talented and dedicated, the daughter of a prominent clan family. Master Garrett, she said, her voice shaking, I need your help. They're trying to stop the bonding. The class went silent. Garrett set down the clay he'd been demonstrating with. Slow down. What bonding? Mine with Tomas. She gestured to one of the human students, a young man with carpenter's hands and an earnest face who was now standing rigid with anxiety. We declared our intent to the council last week. Today they rejected it. On what grounds? They said, she swallowed hard. They said that while your bonding to the Wave Chief was acceptable, given the political circumstances, they can't allow common citizens to form mixed bonds, that it would set a precedent that could destabilize clan structure. Garrett felt something cold settle in his chest. He'd known this was coming. They'd been waiting 15 years for someone to use his own relationship as a justification for restricting others. Who specifically made this argument? Elder Gresh, with support from 3 other council members. Of course it was Gresh, the man who'd opposed Garrett from the beginning, who'd been waiting for an opportunity like this. Where's Thera? In emergency council session. They called it this morning. Tomas and I aren't allowed to attend because we're not formally recognized as bonded. Garrett looked at the young couple, Kira with her fierce determination, Tomas with his quiet strength, and saw himself in Thera 15 years ago. Terrified and certain, impossible and inevitable. Class dismissed, he said. Kira, Tomas, come with me. They found Thera in the council chamber, her face composed, but her eyes carrying the particular sharpness that meant she was furious and controlling it. The council was in heated debate when Garrett entered. Gresh was mid-argument, his voice carrying across the chamber. Cannot allow every common citizen to pursue these bonds simply because the Wave Chief did so. Her situation was extraordinary. Political necessity, but to permit widespread mixing would dilute our cultural identity. Dilute, Thera's voice cut across his. Or evolve, these are not the same things. With respect, Wave Chief, you made your choice for political reasons. These young people are making choices from mere sentiment. Stop. Garrett's voice wasn't loud, but it carried authority born from 15 years of earning respect. Stop saying that. The council turned to look at him. He wasn't technically a council member, but his position as consort to the Wave Chief gave him the right to speak. I married Thera for many reasons. Garrett continued, walking to stand beside her. Political alliance was one, but if you think sentiment didn't play a role, you're wrong. And if you think sentiment is less important than politics, you're building your society on sand. This is precisely the problem, Gresh said. Human emotion clouding orcish reason. Emotion isn't human, Kira interjected, her voice shaking but determined, and reason isn't orcish. Both our peoples feel. Both our peoples think. Pretending otherwise is what's causing the problem. You're young, Gresh said dismissively. You don't understand what's at stake. I understand perfectly, Kira shot back. You're afraid. You're afraid that if orcs and humans can love each other, marry each other, build families together, then all the reasons you've used to keep us separate fall apart. The chamber erupted in argument. Half the council shouted agreement, half shouted opposition. Thera let it continue for exactly 30 seconds, then stood. The room went silent. We will vote, Thera said. Not today. We need time to consider this properly. But we will vote within the week on whether to allow common citizens to pursue mixed bonds or whether such bonds will remain restricted to extraordinary political circumstances. She looked directly at Gresh. And we will be very clear about what we're actually voting on. Are we voting to restrict love based on species? Because that's what this is. Not policy, not cultural preservation. Control over who our people are allowed to care about. The meeting adjourned in tense silence. That evening in their private quarters, Thera paced while Garrett sat by the fire. Gresh has been planning this, she said, waiting for the right moment. He knows if he can frame our bonding as exceptional rather than exemplary, he can prevent others from following. He might win, Garrett said quietly. The vote could go either way. I know. She stopped pacing and looked at him. Would you still have come here if you'd known it would lead to this, that our choice would become a weapon against others? Yes, because our choice proved it's possible. And that matters even if Gresh tries to limit it. He stood and crossed to her. But we need to do more than just argue in council. We need to show people what they're voting for. What do you mean? I mean, we invite everyone to meet Kira and Tomas, not as a political issue, as people. Let the clans see who they're deciding about. Over the next 5 days, they organize a series of gatherings, dinners, workshop sessions, community events where Kira and Tomas could be present not as petitioners, but as participants, where people could see the young couple working together, laughing together, existing together. It was Thera's idea to have them help repair the seawall physical work that required coordination and trust. Dozens of clan members worked alongside them, and by the end of the day, most had stopped thinking about species and started thinking about competence. It was Garrett's idea to have them present a joint project to the Craft Guild, a piece of furniture that combined orc woodworking strength with human decorative techniques. The guild members, pragmatic to their core, focused on the quality of the work. Slowly, the conversation shifted. Not everywhere, not universally, but enough. The vote came on the 7th day. The council chamber was packed. Every seat filled, people standing along the walls. Kira and Tomas sat in the gallery, holding hands, trying to control their fear. The debate was extensive. Gresh made his arguments about cultural preservation and traditional values. Others countered with points about adaptation and growth. Then, Vokara stood. The ancient advisor rarely spoke in council anymore, her age making every word costly. When she did speak, people listened. I am old, she said, her voice thin but clear. I have seen 3 wave chiefs lead this clan. I have seen wars and peace, abundance, and famine, triumph and tragedy. And I will tell you what I have learned. She paused, gathering strength. Culture is not preserved through restriction. It is preserved through practice. What makes us orc is not who we bond with. It is how we treat honor, how we face challenges, how we build community. These things do not change because someone loves across species lines. She looked at Kira. This young woman is orc in every way that matters. Her choice of partner does not diminish that. It expands our understanding of what it means to build family. Vokara sat down exhausted. The vote was called for allowing common citizens to pursue mixed bonds, 12 against 9. Abstaining 2, it passed. Barely, but it passed. Kira and Tomas were bonded 3 months later in a ceremony that combined both traditions attended by hundreds who wanted to witness history. But the real victory wasn't the ceremony, it was what happened after. Over the next 2 years, 6 more mixed couples formally bonded, some orc-human, some involving other species from distant territories who'd heard about the coastal clan's openness. Each bonding was challenged. Each required defending. But each one made the next slightly easier. The resistance didn't disappear. Gresh and his supporters continued to oppose every expansion of integration. But they were slowly becoming the minority voice rather than the conservative majority. Garrett watched this transformation with a mixture of pride and exhaustion. He was 50 now, feeling every year of it in his joints and his back. The work of building something new was harder than he'd anticipated, and some days he wondered if he had the energy to continue. There was a night about a year after Kira's bonding when he said as much to Thera. "I'm tired," he admitted. "What of you, not of this life, but of fighting, of constantly having to justify our existence to people who will never accept it." "You don't have to fight anymore," Thera said. "We've won the important battles. The structure is in place. Others can carry it forward now." "Can they, without us actively defending it?" "Yes, because it's not about us anymore. Look at Kira and Tomas. Look at the others. They're not asking our permission. They're not waiting for us to lead. They're building their own lives." She took his hand. "We did what we needed to do. We proved it was possible. We created the framework, but we don't have to carry it alone forever." He realized she was right. The movement they'd started had grown beyond them. It would continue whether they actively pushed it or not. That realization was liberating and terrifying in equal measure. The test of that theory came 18 months later when Thera's health began to fail. It started with fatigue that didn't improve with rest, then pain in her joints that the healers struggled to explain. Within 6 months, it became clear this was something serious, something that would require her to step back from active leadership. The transition of power was complicated. Thera's younger cousin Marek was the natural heir, experienced, respected, politically astute. But he'd been one of the council members who'd abstained from the vote on mixed bonds. His position on integration was unclear. During the formal transfer of leadership, Marek made a speech that clarified where he stood. "My cousin has led this clan through transformation," he said. "She has built alliances that would have been unthinkable a generation ago. She has proven that strength comes not from isolation, but from integration." He paused. "I did not always agree with her methods. I worried about moving too fast, about losing what makes us distinct. But I was wrong to worry. We have not lost our identity. We have expanded it." He looked directly at Garrett. "And we have been strengthened by those who came from outside and chose to become part of us. I will continue that legacy, not because it's politically convenient, because it's right." The transfer of power proceeded. Thera stepped down with grace. Marek took leadership with a commitment to maintain the integrated structures they'd built. And Garrett, for the first time in 20 years, stepped fully out of politics. He returned to what he'd always loved most, working with clay, teaching students, creating beautiful things with his hands. Thera, recovering slowly from whatever illness had taken her strength, spent her days reading, advising when asked, and enjoying the luxury of time that belonged to no one but herself. They were sitting by the ocean one afternoon, 3 years after Thera's retirement, when she said something that surprised him. "I want to go back. Back where? To your cottage, on the cliffs. I want to see where it all started." The cottage had been maintained over the years by various tenants, but it was currently empty. They made the journey slowly, taking 5 days for what would have been a 2-day trip in their youth. When they arrived, the cottage looked smaller than Garrett remembered. The same stone walls, the same slate roof, but somehow diminished by memory. They went inside. The furniture was different, but the basic structure was unchanged. The hearth where he'd first treated her wounds. The narrow bed where she'd slept while he took the floor. the pottery wheel in the corner. It's strange being back, Thera said, running her hand along the wall. I was so desperate when I was here, so certain my life was over if I went back to my father's hold. And now I understand that endings and beginnings are often the same moment, just seen from different angles. They stayed at the cottage for a week, long enough to remember who they'd been, long enough to appreciate who they'd become. On their last evening, they sat by the fire just as they had 23 years earlier, and Garrett said something he'd been thinking about for months. When we're gone, do you think it will last, what we built? Some of it, Thera said. Not all, that's the nature of things. But the important part, the proof that it's possible that will last. Because we didn't just talk about integration, we lived it. I hope you're right. I am right. Look at Kira and Thomas. They have a daughter now. Half orc, half human, completely herself. She's growing up in a world where her existence isn't political. It's just normal. She leaned her head against his shoulder. That's what we gave them. Not perfection, not easy answers, but normalcy. The radical gift of being unremarkable. Garrett thought about that. The radical gift of being unremarkable. Of love that didn't require justification. Of partnerships that didn't need defending. Of children who could exist without being political statements. We did good work, he said quietly. We did impossible work, Thera corrected, which turned out to be possible after all. They both sat in comfortable silence as the fire burned low, two people who'd chosen each other against every reasonable objection and built a life that had rippled out to change hundreds of others. When they returned to the Wave Chief hold 2 weeks later, they found a surprise waiting. The council, with Marek's blessing, had commissioned a memorial. Not to them specifically, but to the ideal they represented. It was a sculpture placed in the main courtyard. 2 figures, one clearly orc and one clearly human, standing side by side with hands clasped, not looking at each other, but looking forward together. At the base, a simple inscription in both languages. Here stood 2 people who proved that impossible was just another word for not yet. Their courage made what came after possible. Garrett stared at it for a long time. Thera stood beside him, her hand finding his exactly as the sculpture depicted. It's not us, she said. Not specifically. It's everyone who made the same choice, who chose connection over fear. I know, but it started with us. It started with you stopping when you could have walked past. He smiled. Best decision I ever made. Me too. They stood there as the sun set, 2 people grown old, together, surrounded by the evidence of what their love had built. Not just for them, but for everyone who came after. It wasn't perfect. Nothing ever was. There were still resistors, still people who believed the old ways were better, still challenges that would test the structures they'd created. But the foundation held.